Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony, and welcome to this overview of the Book of Exodus. This is especially for those who attend the Beacon Church in Ashton and Makerfield, but others are very welcome to come along for the ride. A year or so back as a church, we looked at the first part of the Book of Exodus, and we're about to head into the second part of the book. So I hoped it would be helpful to spend some time reminding us of what we've already seen and to look ahead at what's to come. Exodus means way out, think exit. And we use the word to describe both the event of God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, as well as the book, which tells the story of how he did so. And as we've seen, what a story it is. A murderous ruler, an oppressed people, a baby in a makeshift boat, a bush that burns but doesn't burn up, a series of incredible signs and wonders, a nation walking through a dried up sea, a mountain that shakes, laws written on stone tablets, a strange tent containing unusual furniture. No wonder the book of Exodus has captured the imagination of artists and filmmakers down the ages. In fact, the Exodus is one of the most filmed parts of the Bible. But most of the movies stop with the event itself, which ends up not being true to the book. God rescues Israel from bondage and sets them free. But as we saw in our series on the first part of the book, that freedom isn't the freedom to do whatever they want. They're freed from serving Egypt in order to serve God. As God says through Moses as early as chapter 4, this is what the Lord says: Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship or serve me. And that's why we've called our series Freed to Serve. Eugene Peterson, author of the Message paraphrase of the Bible, he reminds us of the basic structure of the book of Exodus. He writes, about half the book is a gripping narrative of an obscure and severely brutalized people who are saved from slavery into a life of freedom. The other half is a meticulous, something tedious, basic instruction and training in living the saved, free life. The story of salvation is not complete without both halves. And it's that second half of the book that we're coming to in our new series. But let's clock that the book as a whole tells a story which is central to the entire Bible: the salvation of the people of God for service to God for the sake of the nations. And of course, the book starts a path that echoes through the rest of Scripture and leads ultimately to Jesus in a way that continues to shape us as God's people today. Exodus is a long book with many parts, and it's easy to get lost. But there are some basic divisions that are helpful to bear in mind, and each of these brings out different dimensions of the book. According to some, the book can be divided into two main parts: the departure of the people from Egypt in chapters 1 to 15, and the journey to and arrival at Mount Sinai in chapters 16 to 40. And that sees chapter 15 as a pivot point in the book. Chapter 15 is the song celebrating the crossing of the sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army. That song looks back to what God has done in delivering his people, but also looks forward to what God will do in bringing them into the land. Others do a twofold division in a different way, with the main break at chapter 18, right before the encounter with God at Mount Sinai. But part of the problem with the twofold division is that the people leave Egypt in chapter 13, though they aren't fully delivered until chapter 15, and they don't actually get to Sinai until chapter 19. So it's helpful to see a middle section between Egypt and Sinai, with the people in the wilderness. That's a division of the book based on geography, but it also carries a sense of a movement and a journey, that a transition is taking place. And we can also see it as a movement from power to provision to presence. And I'm using those words to try to capture what's going on in each main section, and in a way that keeps the main focus on God. So in the first section, God reveals something of his power to his people and to Pharaoh in Egypt. In the second section, God provides for his people in the wilderness. And in the third section, God makes himself present with his people at Sinai and then through the tabernacle. So, with that threefold division in mind, let's come to the first section, Egypt, which stretches all the way from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 15, verse 21. And we begin with what I'm calling the prelude to the main action, with the people suffering in Egypt. We start the book with the theme of multiplication. The book of Exodus picks up where the book of Genesis leaves off, with Jacob's family in Egypt. But when we join Exodus, God's people have grown in numbers in Egypt, not only fulfilling God's promise to Abraham of many descendants, but echoing God's command at creation for humanity to be fruitful and multiply. But that growth leads to exploitation, because from Pharaoh's point of view, the teeming Israelites pose a threat. So first of all, he enslaves them. Then he orders their midwives to kill the sons at birth. Then when that plan backfires, he commands the Egyptian to throw their baby sons into the Nile. And that introduces us to Moses and a period of preparation where Moses is saved through water and grows up in the Egyptian palace and shepherds in the desert, all of which prepares him for what lies ahead. What comes next is revelation at the burning bush, the revealing of God's name to Moses, I am who I am, and the commission of Moses to lead the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. But that's not going to be a gentle walk by the Nile. There's confrontation, not just with Pharaoh, but complaints from the Israelites themselves who are made to work harder. And yet in chapter 7, verse 7, God explains to Moses that he's planning to act in such a way that the people will know that he is the Lord. And that brings us to the next section in this opening part of the book, the plagues. Except, of course, they're not actually called plagues. They're called signs and wonders. There's a whole series of them, the river Nile turning to blood, frogs everywhere, gnats everywhere, hail, cattle being struck down, and so on. So this is a period of destruction in which God demonstrates his supremacy over Egypt and its gods through this series of signs and wonders. Every so often, Pharaoh says, okay, you can go. But then when the difficulty stops, he changes his mind and says, actually, no, you can't. Pharaoh remains opposed to setting the people free. And that brings us to redemption, with the promise of the death of the firstborn sons in Egypt, the final and most destructive sign. So we come next to the Passover, salvation in Egypt. The theme of redemption continues here as God's people are given instructions for how to prepare themselves for this last and greatest sign. When God comes in judgment, he sees the blood of a lamb on the doorframe and he passes over the house, and the firstborn son is safe. And so what follows is liberation, when Pharaoh commands them to go and a large mixed multitude of people leave Egypt. And we're then given some regulations about commemoration. What God has done needs to be remembered, not just in the annual Passover meal, but in the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the consecration of firstborn sons and animals to the Lord. But just when we think it's all over, the story reaches a new hurdle, because finally in this opening section comes what we might think of as passage, the escape from Egypt. Even after all this, God has one more demonstration of power, the salvation of his people through water and the destruction of Pharaoh's army. And that gives way to Moses and Miriam leading the people in a song of celebration for God's victory. It might feel like a great end to us, except, of course, at this point, we're not even halfway through the book. This is only the first part of the book set in and around Egypt. So what comes next is a transitional section in the book where the people are in the wilderness. Now, this wasn't the wanderings in the wilderness for 40 years. That would come later. But the people pretty much straight away demonstrate the sort of attitude that would lead to those years of wandering. Even before they get to Sinai, a period of about 2 months, we hear them grumble on a number of occasions. But God graciously provides for their needs. And that's what we see first in this section: provision of needs, water and food in particular. We have several stories of God doing this. God provides water for them at the end of chapter 15. In chapter 16, they complain about lack of food, and God provides manna and quail for them. Then they're thirsty again and complain again at the start of chapter 17. This time, God instructs Moses to strike a rock with his rod, and the rock brings forth water. But in addition to providing for their needs, God protects them from threats of various kinds. Some of the threats are external. When the people are attacked by the Amalekites in chapter 17, Moses raises the rod that symbolizes the presence of God, and they beat back the threat. Then the final part of this section in chapter 18 sees Moses reunited with Jethro, his father-in-law. Jethro gives him some good advice about a different kind of threat, an internal one, how to deal with his overwhelming responsibilities and learn to delegate out some of his work of judging the people. But it's helpful for us to spot how God is shaping his people through this wilderness period. What we have in this whole section is God making himself known to his people so that he might make himself known through his people. So the giving of manna every day and a double portion on the Sabbath helps to prepare them for the law that God would give them. The Lord's provision in food and water is meant to foster trust in him, to remind them of who he is and what he's done for them. Then their battle against the Amalekites is another way the Lord prepares them for what lies ahead. Whereas Israel was mostly passive in the destruction of the Egyptian army, the Lord did it for them. They're required now to fight against Amalek. They're going to shift from being passive to taking on a more active role as they press on. So in this section, the God who delivers his people is the God who provides for his people and protects them and forms them to remember that he's their God. And as we discover in the next section, it's through his people formed as a holy nation that the Lord will bring about his purposes in the world. And that brings us to the final main section of the book, Sinai. In the wilderness, Israel experienced God's presence in a new way. But now at Sinai, God makes himself known to the people in a similar way to how he met with Moses at the burning bush. And then the last part of the book tells the story of how God's presence would be able to continue with the people through the construction of the tabernacle. Now, that's it in a nutshell, but let's dig a little deeper. When the people get to Sinai, God gives them a similar experience to what Moses encountered at the burning bush. Just as God commissioned Moses, so now he commissions the entire nation, declaring them in chapter 19, verse 6, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So we begin this section of the book with the covenant made and confirmed. Remember, the whole story is about Israel being set free to serve God. And so in chapters 19 to 24, God establishes them as his special covenant people. Israel was chosen as a treasured possession to play a priestly role as a holy nation, living a distinctive life before the nations, a life that embodied God's design for humanity to showcase what God intends for the whole world, life under God's rule and blessing. So it's no surprise that the commandments which follow are given to guide Israel in living out their calling as a holy nation, as the people are set apart to be a light to the nations. And a whole variety of laws are presented in this section, showing that God is concerned with every area of life. And then in chapter 24, at the end of this subsection, the relationship with God is ratified in the sprinkling of blood on the people. This reinforces the consecration of God's people to their holy calling as priests and to live in such a way that they faithfully represent God to the nations. What follows then are instructions for building the tabernacle, the special tent. God is actually going to live among them. But if the holy and awesome God is to dwell among them, he'll need an appropriate place to live. And so the main purpose of this section is to show how God himself will provide a way for him to be present with his people. The tabernacle is the place where he dwells with his people. And this is really important in the overall scheme of things. Over 1/3 of the book of Exodus is dedicated to describing the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the table for the bread of the presence, the lampstand, and the tabernacle itself. Priestly procedures are described, including the clothes they're to wear and the tools they're to use for the sacrifices and for burning incense. So we get to the end of chapter 31, and we're all set up for the building of this tent. But chapters 32 to 34 come as a dramatic and terrible interruption. Because between the command to build the tabernacle and the fulfillment of that command, the Israelites threaten the relationship between themselves and the Lord by building and then worshipping a golden calf. Now, after the making and ratification of the covenant back in chapters 19 to 24, the people break it in one fell swoop. And we need to feel the weight of these chapters. Whether God will dwell with his people or even let them survive becomes a real question in the aftermath of the people's rebellion. But in response to Moses' prayer, God confirms that he will continue with the people. Not only that, but he shows Moses something of his glory. So after this shocking interruption of the golden calf episode, the story now returns to the construction of the tabernacle. The crisis is over. God will dwell with his people. And so the tabernacle can be built. And in these chapters, many of the details from chapters 25 to 31 are repeated. But the willing obedience of the people is now stressed in contrast to the disobedience of the previous episode. And the end of the book comes in chapter 40 as the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. God's presence now dwells with his people. Now, this long section on the tabernacle might feel really tedious to us, but it's important not to miss what's going on. The climax of the book of Exodus isn't the Passover or the crossing of the sea or the giving of the Ten Commandments, but the end of this section. And it's a powerful message that God dwells with his people and that those people will become the means by which others might be drawn to love and serve the Lord. So there you go, the book of Exodus. It tells of a God who is the Lord of redemption and revelation, who frees his people and makes himself known to his people. And he's a God of holiness and mission who sets apart his people and forms them to play a part in his purposes for the world. And the whole book is driving towards that climax of God's people in God's presence, carrying that presence with us into the nations to bear witness to the one true God. That's why we're freed to serve. May it be so.